Imagine a day in Paris, but not present day. Go back to 1927, the Jazz Age. It's summertime and some recognizable people are milling about the City of Light. Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Josephine Baker, Marcel Proust. They were famous back then too, but in Alex George's new historical fiction, they play second fiddle to four people who you could call ordinary. But Alex George gives extraordinary stories of loss in the Paris hours, where their individual tales collide in a stunning ending.
It's been interesting to watch the reactions from readers, and some people have gone, "Oh, that was perfect," and other people have gone, "No, you can't stop there." And so there's been a mixture, and some people have actually done both, and they've gone, "You can't stop there," but it was perfect. So there've been a number of different kinds of reactions to it.
That ending and the scenes leading up to it transport you to the historic streets of Paris. Streets this British lawyer turned Missouri lawyer, novelist, and bookstore owner knows well. At 13, he went to boarding school in Paris and then practiced law there early in his career. He was happy to return, if only in his mind.
I write in the mornings. I get up at 5 every day and write. And I would sometimes sort of open up my computer and go onto Facebook and say, "Right, I'm off to Paris," and then close it down and then start writing. Then the next time I'd look at Facebook, everyone would be going, "Oh, I'm so jealous. Oh, when are you back?" And I was going, no, I'm not actually off. I'm just like, in my head, I'm going to Paris. It's like in my imagination. And it's a fun place to spend a couple of hours every morning, even when you're living in the middle of Missouri.
In this entertaining and authentic conversation, Alex George talks about the challenges of writing his seventh novel, particularly since The Paris Hours is told over the course of a single day.
It was a complete nightmare, but I'm glad I did it.
Why you won't find a photo of a certain iconic landmark anywhere in the book.
No Eiffel Tower.
Right.
That was the only thing that I really cared about.
And the significance of the song that's been playing since the start of this video. And how it affected several sections of his book.
I remember writing that piece, and mostly I type on the computer, and I didn't do that, and I wrote it longhand with a pencil of all things. It was very sort of very old-fashioned, and I just had it on repeat, listening, and it was fun. I enjoyed that a lot.
Alex George, thank you so much for joining us from your home in Columbia, Missouri, right?
Yep, that's where I am. Nice to be here, Angie.
Wonderful. Well, I have to tell you, after I finished your book, I have yet to stop thinking about the ending. I can't stop thinking about it. And you know, what would happen in that next scene and all the little connection clues that I missed along the way. Was that your hope for your readers?
Well, I mean, yes, by the end of the book, that was exactly my hope. And it just felt, writing books is not a science, it's all gut. At least it is for me anyway. And that just felt right. I just thought that leaving it somewhat unresolved was probably the way to go. The interesting thing about the ending, though, is that it came in its present form, and I'm not going to give anything away, fairly late on in the process. In fact, the book had already been purchased by Macmillan, and I was sitting down with my editor, and as you do, having these big editorial meetings, and she was going, "Well, I think we need to change this, and have you thought about this?" Just tweaking it and trying to polish it. And then she said something to me. She said, "Have you thought about maybe X being Y?" And I thought, "Oh, that's funny. She's got those two things confused." And I said, "No, you don't mean that." And she said, "No, that's what I mean." And then this sort of light bulb went off, and I thought, "Oh, that's rather good." So I then sort of rewrote the ending, and then had to work backwards and sort of reverse engineer the whole thing to get to that point, which was complicated when you have a structure like the one I sort of imposed on myself. It was something of a headache to do it, but hopefully it was worth it.
Can you give a brief description for those who haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet of what this book is about?
Sure. So the Paris Hours is set over the course of one day on a hot summer's day in Paris in 1927. And it's a novel, but there are really 4 individual stories that are told in this book, and they're told in sort of strictly alternating rotation. And each of and although the stories are intertwined and cross-pollinate with each other at various points, but really each story has its own principal character. So there are 4 main characters in the book. One of them is a destitute painter who's also sort of lovesick and is on the run from some thugs to whom he owes money. There is an Armenian puppeteer who is a refugee from the Armenian genocide and who performs puppet shows in the public parks in Paris for children in a language that they don't understand. There is a writer who is walking the streets looking for his daughter who he lost. And then finally, there is the maid of Marcel Proust, the great writer. And the story really began with her. I was reading the memoir of Proust's actual maid, Celeste Alberet. And at one point in the memoir, she talks about how Proust asked her to burn some notebooks that he had written in really the bones of his novel, In Search of Lost Time. And she burned them. And the novelist in me is always, novelists are like magpies, we're always on the lookout for shiny things that we want to pick up. And that was one for me. And I just thought immediately, as novelists often do, that, well, what if, what if she had saved one of those notebooks and hadn't burned them all? And that was the first question. And the second question was, and what if there was something in that notebook that was important? And so really from that little seed, the rest of the story sort of emerged.
You just mentioned that there are the 4 separate characters,
Mm-hmm.
and their stories are told individually, and then they kind of converge at the end. So,
right.
Did you write it the way that it is in the book, or did you write each of their stories individually? How did you go about that?
Yeah, no, I didn't write it the way that it appears in the book, because in order to do that, my brain would have to be about 50,000 times bigger than it actually is, because trying to hold all of that in place would be almost impossible. So what I did was to write one character, and I'd write a chunk, like 6 or 7 chapters, one after the other. So that particular story would sort of get you do like a third of it at once, and then do the next one, and then do the next one. So I had these 4 stories, and then I kind of almost literally shuffled them together so that they were going in rotation. And it was the magnitude of the headache is hard to, it was a real pain, because I had, as I mentioned, the whole story takes place over the course of one day, and each of those chapters, although they go in strict rotation, it also moves the day forward chronologically. So it was incredibly hard to do, and I would think that I had done it, and then I would realize that sort of halfway through there was a sort of a glitch in the space-time continuum. We went back a bit, so then I had to move everything around again. And it's one of those things where you move one tiny thing and it's like dominoes and everything else falls over. So it required a lot of patience and a lot of coffee and and a great deal of focus just to make sure everything worked. And there were many people have asked, well, why did you set it in one day? And I've been asking myself that a lot. It's like it was a complete nightmare, but I'm glad I did it. It was fun to do. It's always, when you write books, it's fun to set yourself little challenges, even if they do occasionally make you want to beat your head against a wall. So I enjoyed it, but it was hard. It was complicated.
Wow. And you had, like you said, you had to be careful, especially when you change the ending to make sure that the little secrets, you're not revealing them, right? That you had to be
right. Yeah, and that was fun too, and to go back and sort of you drop these little clues in here and there. And a lot of people have said, well, I got to the end and then I just turned back to the beginning and started reading again just to see where these various things were. So that's kind of been fun to watch as well.
I have to tell you, I finished the book and I said, but wait a minute. And I had to turn back and reread sections and go, I read that like I had made something up in my head about how something was. That was kind of fun.
Sneaky novelist. You got to watch him.
That's right. Well, the other thing that I find so interesting is that you do have some very famous people in this book, including Josephine Baker, a St. Louis native.
Yes, of course.
But they are secondary. And so I'm wondering, why did you decide to sprinkle in these, Ernest Hemingway and Marcel Proust in here?
So originally, they weren't going to be secondary. I first got the idea for writing a book set in Paris in this time when one evening I was driving in the car and listening to the radio, and there was some music by Ravel that came on, which was gorgeous. And then at the end of the piece, the announcer was talking about the genesis of the piece, and it was commissioned by the Russian impresario Serge Diaghilev, who formed this very famous ballet company in Paris called Les Ballets Russes. And the roster of people who Diaghilev had on his sort of side, on his team to put these things on was just ridiculous. So you had Ravel and Stravinsky and Debussy writing music for you. You had Jean Cocteau writing the librettos. You had Coco Chanel designing the costumes and Marc Chagall doing the backdrop. I mean, it was nutty. And I just sat there in my car thinking, oh, well, that's my next book. That's what I'm going to do, because that's insane. And how interesting would that be? So I began to do a lot of research about Paris in the 1920s and about these incredible geniuses that worked with Diaghilev. And I had a wonderful time doing it. And that was sort of where I found the memoir, the Proust's Maids memoir, was during the course of that research. But I began to realize that, well, let me put it another way. I began to wonder whether those people really needed me to tell their story.
Right.
Because, if you listen to a Ravel melody, I mean, the art sort of speaks for itself. They don't actually need me to come along and do that for them. And so I began to think about but I was filming in Paris in 1927. I'd done all this research and I had a great deal of sort of thoughts about it. So I wanted to write something. And so I just thought, well, we'll just change the focus. We'll shift the focus away from these well-known people and instead tell 4 different stories, much more quiet, if you like, and more ordinary. But I wanted to season the narrative with little cameos by these more famous inhabitants of the city at the time. So that was kind of how it worked. And that was always how I wrote. So I never wrote it with those famous people being more central. But before I began the writing, that was always the idea. And then there was a shift.
Well, I love the parts with Ravel, because those felt so vivid to me, and I did not know that song, so I had to go and look it up afterwards. So I was so curious about it, and it is such a beautiful, beautiful song.
It's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking, and people have said that. They say, oh, well, I went to go and listen to that piece of music, and I love that too, because it's like, not only do I get to tell this story, but I can also sort of go, hey, by the way, you should listen to this because it's really beautiful. And it's just another chance to, hopefully spread the word about beautiful things.
The book is obviously set in Paris. We've talked about that. But I read that when you came to the cover of your book, you were very specific about one thing, which was not to include
no Eiffel Tower. Right. That was the only thing that I really cared about. And Macmillan, who are a new publisher for me, and it's been such a joy to be published by them. They're absolutely wonderful. They sent me this thing that I'd never seen before, which is a whole questionnaire about covers and my thoughts about covers and philosophy about covers. And I answered it all, of course, like a good author. But really, all I wanted to go was no Eiffel Tower, which I duly did. And of course, because of that, because they all have a good sense of humor, and I think realized that I could be teased a little bit, everything I saw had an Eiffel Tower on it, to the point where the internal page design that they do mock-ups of what the page looks like. They actually had a little Eiffel Tower, a little sort of picture of an Eiffel Tower next to every page number. So they had some fun with me on that one. But, I mean, it didn't appear in the book, and there it is, and there is no Eiffel Tower in sight. And I love this cover, and it's not always the case that you do, but this is wonderful. And I love the fact that it's an interior scene, because a lot of the book feels, to me anyway, to be interior, and sort of it's, either happens on the inside or it's about what people are thinking about. So it felt really right to me, and it's also just a beautiful color. And so I was happy not to see the Eiffel Tower in the final thing.
The reason to not want that was just because it's just so, it's what everybody thinks of, or what was the reason that you were so against it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is what everybody thinks about. And, one of the challenges of writing a book about Paris is that everybody comes to Paris and thinks about Paris with certain preconceptions. Either they've been there, or they haven't, but they've seen enough movies about it. I mean, the Eiffel Tower is, I would think, the most recognizable architectural structure in the world. So right there, you are always combating preconceptions. And one of the jobs of a novelist, I think, is to sort of go against that a little bit and try and surprise your reader in some ways. So the Eiffel Tower is referenced, I think, once or twice in the book, but nobody ever goes near it. Right. And that is indeed how it is. If you go to Paris, I mean, I lived in Paris for over a year when I was working as an attorney there, and no Parisians ever go near the thing. And so I wanted to sort of get that across as well. And it was, I mean, it was a constant process of working out, well, I want to write about Paris. I want to write about it in a sort of really true and meaningful way, but also to subvert those expectations a little bit. And so, one of the things was to take the narrative away from the more obvious tourist attractions that people might actually recognize and go, oh yeah, no, I've been there, and take it, more into the back streets and things like that. So that was a deliberate move on my part, for sure.
So you've lived there. You just mentioned you worked there as an attorney, but then you also went. That wasn't the first time that you'd lived there, right?
No, I went to school there when I was 13. I went to boarding school. I had been in boarding school before, and I was going to another boarding school in the fall. And so there was this summer where I really had nothing to do. And my parents thought, well, we've had enough of him. Let's go and send him off and make him sort of learn a language. And so I did. And I was fairly miserable for most of the time that I was there. I was quite homesick. And when I started, my French was passable, but not great. But by the time I came out, it was much, much better. And it's interesting because of that meant that if you suddenly fast forward 8 or 9 years, when I had qualified as an attorney, I went to go to Paris because I spoke French. And so it's funny how these little things become huge, and you have no way of knowing at the time.
You are a bookseller. You own Skylark Books, right? In
Yes.
Columbia. Okay, so what is it like then to, have this bookstore where your books are being sold? I assume you're selling your books there, right?
Yes, we do. Yeah. It's so it's interesting, and it's been a process for me. When we opened the shop, I kind of insisted that my books should not have any special billing. They're spine. They're not face out. They're just like spine out on the shelves, just in the G's along with everybody else. And I was sort of going, yeah, that's not really why we're here. This isn't, we're just selling books. One of the best things about working in a bookstore is the ability to give people suggestions and recommendations when they ask for them. And for the first 6 months or so, I would never recommend my own books, and partly because there's so many other wonderful books out there. But my staff would, and they would sort of go, oh, we should read this book or that book, and then they'd point at me and go, that's the author, and if you ask nicely, he'll sign it for you. And so, and after a while, I sort of thought, well, if everyone else is doing it, I might as well get in on the act as well. And so I did. But I sort of, after a while, stopped because there were one or two customers who I think I just got the impression that they bought my book because they thought it would have been rude not to after I had suggested it. And the last thing I'd ever want to do would be to sort of guilt somebody into buying my book, unless they are close family members, of course.
Right.
And so I kind of stopped doing that and just, yeah. So, and there are, so it's fun though. And with this new book, I've not published a book and owned a bookstore before. And really all I'm doing these days is we have a mezzanine floor and I'm sitting up there signing, I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of books and putting them into envelopes and getting ready to mail them off. So that's been a lot of fun.
So I have to ask, since you're a bookseller, if you have any recommendations for our viewers.
Well, yes. I mean, I've got a gazillion of them. We're selling a lot of The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, and a lot of the new Hilary Mantel book as well. I mean, the book that I'm actually reading, the book at the moment that's just come out in paperback, and it's called Mostly Dead Things by Kristen Arnett. And it's really weird, but kind of fabulous. It's about a family of taxidermists in Florida. So, make it that way. And another book that we have sold an awful lot of is a wonderful book of micro essays by, actually this would be my recommendation without any other information, given the pandemic and given everything that's going on at the moment. So this book of essays is called The Book of Delights, and it's by Ross Gay, who's a wonderful poet who lives in Bloomington. And he just had the idea one day, it was more like an exercise for him, of writing down from one birthday to the next birthday over the course of a year, something that he found delight in. And they're quirky and they're small, and some of them are funny and some of them are sad, but they are all uplifting. And he's a wonderful writer, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And we've been selling them by the truckload because, people need to find some delight in their lives. And that's one good way of doing it.
You mentioned that you write at 5 a.m. So does that mean you've started a new book, right?
I have started a new book, yes.
How's that going?
Very, very slowly, to the point of total immobility. I have begun and abandoned 2 other books, and I wrote maybe about 15,000 words of one of them, and then I wrote the opening chapter of a second one, and then I sort of threw them both away, and I've now begun a third one, and I've written 1 chapter of that, quite happy with it, but because of the combination of the pandemic and having this book come out, I haven't written anything. And also because I've been writing some other things for other publications as well. So I haven't actually written anything for the new book for probably about a month, but I'm itching to get back to it.
You have a couple things going on, it sounds like.
Yeah, there are a couple of things. And it's interesting because I talk to a lot of my friends who are writers, and I always say, so are you writing anything? And almost without exception, they're going, oh no. Since the pandemic started, people have come up to me and sort of said, oh, I'm sure you're getting a lot of writing done, aren't you? Because you've got all of this time on your hands. And the answer to that is big fat no. Well, absolutely not, but not for want of trying, but hopefully soon. Hopefully soon. We'll get back to it. But I write very slowly, partly because I do have all of these other jobs, so I do just have a little bit of time at the beginning of each day to do it. But also I just go slowly anyway. Social media is a weird thing, particularly for writers. And there are some writers who will sort of say, well, I wrote 2,000 words today. And it's like, unfriend. I don't want to talk to you anymore. And they just make everyone else feel terrible. So certain things are like how the sausage is made. You just like, don't talk about that. So.
Well, we hope that you find some time in between all the other things to keep working on the other book. I know many of us are excited to read it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's these are such strange times, Angie. I mean, everyone is feeling completely discombobulated. And the thing about writing is that You need time, but just as important, you need space in your head. And that is very hard to come by right now. And I hope that as things get back to normal, whether in the short term or the long term, some of that space will become available again, and I can sort of dive into these stories I want to tell. Every morning, the piano rescues Soren Balakian from his dreams. The same low notes gently tug him away from everything that he has left behind. The ghosts that haunt his sleep are chased away by the music floating up through the floor from the studio below. He opens his eyes. The workbench on the other side of the room, the empty stares of the puppets on the wall. A small gasp of relief escapes his lips. His head falls back onto the pillow as the music washes over him. The first theme emerges from the depths of the piano, no more than a whisper. Soren hears a heavy melancholy in the stately procession of low single notes. Every morning he wonders what the composer has lived through to have drawn such sadness out of himself. And then, through the dark clouds, a shaft of brilliant sunlight. A new melody emerges, high and clear and heartbreaking. This is what Soren waits for. The tune cleaves the gathering shadows and wraps itself brightly around his heart. Those first brooding tones retreat, but they do not vanish. Now the music is two intertwined melodic lines, one low, one high, one sad, one full of hope. They meet and diverge, echoing each other, dual counterpoints of darkness and light. Sometimes they come together in sweet harmony, sometimes not. Finally, the music resolves back to its first theme, that simple, forlorn elegy. The pianist's left hand stretches down the keyboard into ever lower registers until there are no more keys to be pressed, no more notes to be played. Silence crowds in.